Right, if we're filming, we might as well just start.
If you want to start here.
Yes, let's start here. Hello again. So what's been going on this week? First of all, there's a yellow car there normally, and it's not here now. Everybody always says, what's that imp over there? In that exact voice. And it's not here anymore. So basically it was finished some way into last year. Probably, I think we finished it like spring last year. And then the owner couldn't organise getting it picked up, and then it was winter and miserable. So finally, I think it was 2 days ago, he came over, we had a good old chat because I hadn't even seen him for, must have been more than a year. So yeah, we had a good old chat, and he loaded it up and took it back to his house. So he's going to be having a bit of fun. Once we're allowed out and about, he'll be taking that to a track somewhere and giving it a good thrashing, hopefully. So that's that gone. Speaking of cars that are going, the Escort's on the brink. James has finished his heat shield that he was just starting last week. He's been working on the wiring for the power steering. That's pretty much all installed now. That's up and tested. He's literally just cleaning up in here, about to put the seats back in so I can go test driving in that. I might even try and do a little in-car video test drive in that, which would be great. So moving on from that, Utah, big change. It's obviously rolling for the first time. I think we got it onto its wheels yesterday, I think it was. Now these aren't the finished wheels before any alarm bells go off, although looking at the back it does look pretty awesome. We were all a bit like, these are wheels for the Camaro project. They just happen to be the only ones we've got around here that will fit onto this at the moment until we get the proper wheels for this. But we put them on and looked at the back ones, we're like, oh my God, that looks absolutely amazing. It's not the look we're going for on the final car, but it was quite a motivational boost to see it on the floor, even if the front ride height's a bit crazy at the minute. This is quite a good example actually of one of the reasons our engine choice could be considered a reasonable advantage is if you look at the front end, it's actually on standard springs, and that ride height gives some indication of how much lighter this is than the original. Even though, admittedly, the XK6 is a pretty light engine for its day, we've obviously shed a hell of a lot of weight here because this is completely on its droop stops. It's at full droop and almost impossible to move it at the minute. So we knew that these springs weren't going to be the right rate, but we wanted to just throw a set of springs on there so we could assess with it as it is now where we sort of starting from as a baseline. So we know how much lower we need to go with them, how much softer we want to go with them, and then we can literally get those springs back out of there, give them to a spring manufacturer and say, look, we want the springs to be X number of pounds per inch softer than this and X number of inches shorter. But it's just cool to see it rolling. What we've been on with is the air conditioning plumbing. So Trev has now run the aircon pipes round to the compressor. I think Nat probably touched last week on the fact that we've been doing some modifications to the aircon compressor. The top plate on that is designed to take flange type fittings with hard lines off that. We wanted to use threaded fittings throughout. So Adam machined up some threaded spigots to weld onto that to allow us to attach threaded pipes. So that means Trev's now been able to fit all of the aircon pipes. He's fitted the dryer, now the bracket for that's back from anodizing. Another thing Trev's been on this week is the wiring installation. I think last week we showed that we got the wiring harnesses back from Bremax. As usual, Max has done a great job of that. Now he's built a modular loom, which is the way he tends to work. So we've got one central loom which feeds everything behind the dash. That connects to all the switch gear, the PDUs, the ECU. And then it's got plugged in branches, so there's a rear branch which is connected to that, a front chassis branch, and then the engine ECU and engine branch. So Trev's been fitting the front chassis branch of the loom today, which comes through, we sort of planned for all this when we were at the metalwork stage, so it comes through a hole in the inner wing under here. We'd put threaded bosses along the top inside edge of the inner wing along here, so the wiring comes up, runs along those threaded bosses, attaches to those threaded bosses, should I say, feeds this headlight, and then it goes across. There's more threaded bosses under here that we welded on at the metalwork stage to run the wiring across to the other headlight, and then as it goes across there, it's got branches that come out to the pressure switch on the aircon dryer, to the horn and to the cooling fan. Now, on all of the exterior elements of the loom that are open to the elements, we get Max to build those to a pretty high standard in terms of the materials. So it's Raychem Type 44 wire, DS25 heat shrink. Any joins are covered with adhesive line heat shrink, which when you heat it and shrink it, it's got an adhesive in there that melts and completely seals that joint. They're Deutsch DTM and DT connectors, which are also completely watertight when they're connected, and then he heat shrinks the back of those with adhesive line shrink to make that completely watertight as well. All of the wiring is concentrically wound, which is most critical on engine management wiring, where there are sensors to try and minimise interference on the wiring to those sensors. But then it's just good practice to do that throughout. So all of the exterior parts of the loom that are in that DS25 heat shrink are also concentrically wound. So yeah, wiring going in, so that's exciting. What else has Trev been up to on this? I think that's probably about it. So we got the aircon plumbing in, wiring's going in, we got it dropped down off the lift and onto its wheels. I think probably the bits that Adam's been on with are the other areas of interest. So he's been designing the brake fluid reservoir and the steering wheel. Now it wasn't until we got the engine in, I think when I did my last episode 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the fact that having the engine in really highlighted the fact that the original plastic Jaguar X300 brake fluid reservoir looked a bit rubbish in there. So we made the decision to design a new reservoir. We've taken a little bit of inspiration from the sort of shape and radiuses on the corner of the cam covers. So Adam's designed a reservoir that will be machined in billet with a bit of reference to that shape. We're also, the dome nuts that we've used on there as a nod to the original XK6 engine. We're using a smaller version, an M4 dome nut, to hold the top cap onto the reservoir, which will kind of really tie it in visually. And then I think he's just finishing the last detail, which is putting the boss in for the level sender. There's a little float type level sender, which will be through a boss in the side of it. That's the last detail, and then we'll get that sent off for machining. And then the steering wheel, it really came down to the fact that we couldn't really find any aftermarket wheel that was exactly what we wanted. So Adam's now drawn up a design that we and the owner are happy with. And that's starting its multi-stage process of manufacture now. So the main frame of the wheel will be cut from I think it's 1/4 inch aluminium plate, 6082 aluminium, just to get the main shape of it. And then we're going to have the relevant chamfers and details machined into the face of that. The part that goes on each side of that, the sort of donut, if you like, on each side of that, that makes the rim round, is going to be CNC routed out of a suitable material to be determined at the moment. That'll be attached with dowels that are pegged through holes in the main rim and bonded as well. And then once we've got that sort of essentially that steering wheel at that point, it'll then be leathered around the rim. We've also done the boss, so we're doing the PCD, the bolt pattern for the wheel in a Momo PCD. We managed to get a Momo boss for it, which are no longer made, amazingly. We had to buy a used one. They come in like a black painted finish, which we weren't mad keen on, so we've just skimmed the outside of that in the lathe to give it a nice sort of machine diamond turned almost finished. And we've also sorted the horn push for the wheel. So Adam's done a detail in the back of the steering wheel whereby a Momo horn push will sit recessed into the back of the wheel so you don't see the plastic surround. And then where there's normally a little plastic button in the middle for the horn that gives you the sort of finished appearance, we've remade that in machined aluminium so we can then laser etch the logo that we want into it, and it just looks a little bit classier than either the traditional kind of gel bubble badge or a sort of pressed tin horn and push as they sometimes are. So yeah, that's where we're at with that. We'll briefly just skirt past the Stratos. Not a lot to say on that. We had a little tiny fuel weep on one of the fuel rails. They were originally the stainless steel Alpha fuel rails, and we'd welded threaded fittings onto the end of them. And we just had an issue. I think it was where they were originally brazed. The sort of remnants of the braze contaminated our weld, and we had a slightly porous weld, so although it didn't obviously leak, you could just see a tiny wetness of fuel on it, and it was almost so small that it evaporated off before it had a chance to drip, but it was there nonetheless. So Nat went and re-welded that again, but it didn't work. I think it's often with these, once you get a porous weld, you just always get the same porosity coming through if you try and rescue it. So I've just decided, you know what, let's just nip this in the bud, and we're doing a set of billet aluminium fuel rails for that, which I think are just on the bench over there. So let's move on this way. I will just mention that we've had another restock of hoodies and shirts. So certainly the bigger sizes are great. I might be running a bit low on the large hoodies, I think, but other than that, we're pretty well stocked. So if you want to go onto the website and order any of those, you are welcome to do. We'll walk past this. This is a new arrival. Now the Morris has come off the jig. It's a project that we will cover much later in the year, but it is a bit of a top secret project, and unfortunately we can't always cover every project we do, but it is something really special. So watch this space on that one. In the meantime, you'll just see a lot of episodes where we walk past a covered up car. Scott this week, Chevette. Last week he was just finishing off all the underside welds on the rotisserie. He'd been doing a lot of weld grinding basically. He did some reinforced jacking points on it, which was something we discussed with the customer. We've just reinforced a section of the sill seam so you can jack it under the sill seam without damaging it. He then went through and welded up all of the redundant holes in the engine bay that were original wiring or plumbing apertures in the bulkhead, which we didn't want. So they've all been welded up and cleaned up. And at the moment he's working on the fuel tank enclosure. So we're going to have a fuel tank in the boot, which it is originally on the Chevette. But we want to do a couple of things. We want it to be much neater, and we also want it to be sealed from the rest of the cabin. So what we've done is he's made a new piece here. There was an original part slightly further forward, but it had that many little holes and details on it that we didn't need. It didn't really make sense to even try and use that and change it. So we've just got rid of that and done a completely new panel which sits further back directly between the turrets, where it's just a neater way to intersect it. And then he's in the process of building the rest of the structure around that area to support what will be a main cover panel over the top. So he's done a little panel here each side now. The next sections are these, which as you can see will be plug welded in on each side here. They need to be trimmed to length, which is already marked out. That one sits that side. As you can see, he's done a nice little joggled recess in there, mainly for visual effect, but it also stiffens the panel up a bit. That side, the shape of the quarter is actually different, so it's got a different profile on the side. But our plan is that when we've got these quarter trim panels in here, they will come down and meet it where that line is. So the visible portion will be symmetrical on both sides. And then it's just in the process of making the rear section, which will lap in underneath this original flange here on the interior of the boot. That will go all the way through and mate up against the rear panel, and you can't see it, but there's a little 90-degree flange sat in here at the minute, which has been forming to the exact shape of the rear panel. That's going to be bonded to the inside of the rear panel, and this will be spot welded to that flange, which will seal off this cavity from this fuel tank enclosure. This hole will be welded up, the smashing hole the other side will be welded up, and at that point there's no other gap into this area than just the top piece. You can see on here he's done a sort of half-inch recess, and there's going to be a matching half-inch recess spot welded all the way around that whole aperture. And once that's done, we're going to have a 12mm thick carbon Nomex honeycomb panel made, which sits down into that recess. So you'll have a nice carbon fibre panel there that's really strong. That'll be retained by means which we've yet to determine. And then the fuel tank will be underneath. And we're just going to fill the fuel tank directly in the boot on this, so there'll be a hatch in the middle of that panel that you can open up to access the fuel filler, rather than fabricating one into the quarter here as they are originally. And as we did on the grey car we built before, it just seemed simpler and cleaner on this one to fill it here, particularly as he's not too fussed about having a spare wheel. And on this car there is room to put the spare further forward because the cage doesn't inhibit that access. So that's where we're at with that. Next week Scott should be finishing that aperture. Jensen, which is looking quite cool with its body loosely back on. So last week Nat was doing the fabrication work for the installation of the Jag independent rear. he's been carrying on with that. So he's now finished that bulkhead piece, which is what he was forming at the end of last week. And he's also done all of the infill work around this sort of edge of the seat pan area. So all of the section at the front here is done. There's still the front of the boot floor to do, but that was good progress. And he's moved on to doing the engine mounts, which is actually why the bodywork's on. So we wanted to determine, well, A, make sure we actually had bonnet clearance with the engine loosely in as we already had it, and also determine whether there was any scope for getting the engine a little bit higher, because where the engine mounts go at the moment, that's a little bit concerned that it's such a short distance between the chassis leg and the engine. He might need to scallop a section out of the chassis leg itself to actually allow a structure to fit in there, and with a rubber mount as well. So he was hoping to maybe get the engine up from another sort of 10 mil. But it's looking pretty promising in that respect, actually. It certainly fits as it is now. There's probably an inch of clearance between the supercharger and the underside of the bonnet. Obviously, we're keen to keep that as a bigger gap as we can, because of course the engine moves around and it'll generate a lot of heat as well. But certainly really cool to see it at this stage, even with just the bonnet laid on it. It kind of reminds you what a good looking car it is. So that's where we're at with that. We've received the front hubs. We're doing wire wheels on this. So the front hubs, the spindles are essentially the same as Mark II Jag. So Mark II Jag bearings and wire wheel hubs will fit on the front. So we've received those from Torino, that's the company that will be building the wheels for it. The rear end, Torino are going to machine us some bespoke rear hubs for our Jag back end, with the splined fitment for the centre lock wire wheels. So one of the next things, once we've done our rear end construction work, if you like, and we can drop that axle out, I'm going to send off a complete side of that axle to Torino so they can make me a rear hub. And then once we've got the hubs here, we can get all the hubs on, and then we can take measurements to determine the wheel offsets, and particularly relevant on the back, because we're going to be remodeling the shape of the body on the back a little bit wider and making some changes to that. So I'm kind of excited personally to get to that stage, because it's that sort of remodeling shapes and artistic element is something I'm particularly fired up about. So that's that, and it seems like there's loads of really cool stuff this week actually. The Morris, which is finally off the jig, obviously making way for the secret project over there. This is the stage we were all super excited to get to, and it didn't disappoint really. It was just fantastic. You see a car at that height for so long, you sort of forget how small a car they are, and you're just really looking forward to seeing it at its kind of final stance, just to see the overall look. And it's more of a glimpse into the finished product, even though it's nothing like the finished product in terms of the paint, and even the wheels aren't the ones we're going to use. It's just a nice hint of that end result, which keeps you fired up about it. So the last bits we did on the jig, Stu was working on the bonnet. I think we just showed last week that he was just doing some trial hinges on the front to make sure we could get the opening as we wanted it. That worked really well. We'll obviously machine those hinges in alley now to make a nice job of them. But the structure on the inside of the bonnet, he's finished all of that, the structure where they mount onto the bonnet itself. And he wanted to get that done so he could get all of that structure complete there, which was really the last of the, what's the word? The structural parts. Struggling for my words here, but yeah, that's the last of the structural work on the front of the car, which we wanted to do with it on the jig, so we could be sure of all the alignment, and then we were happy to take it off and roll it around. And to be honest, now it probably won't go back on a jig now, it'll stay just rolling around while we do all of the rest of the metalwork on it. We'll obviously then strip it down, put it on the rotisserie to do all of the underside welds, which we've not been able to do with it on the jig. But yeah, light at the end of the tunnel on the metalwork on that. One thing I will mention actually was, it's funny that when we did, I think probably on Instagram or Facebook, some photos of it rolling and photos about the flip front, a lot of people said, oh, isn't it going to be a pain working on the engine bay or filling the fluids with the bonnet flipping that way? And even the owner passed the same comment. And I think you get deceived when a car's on the jig like that. you think you're going to be, you kind of have this vision, and also because you're mindful of more modern cars, you have this vision you're going to be draped out over the wing just to fill the brake fluid or something, and actually it's nothing like that at all. I mean, I can show you right now. It's if we flip that up, the screen wash reservoir is going to be here, and the brake fluid at the same point on the other side, and the coolant fill will just be on the side of the engine here. And in reality, it's literally like knee height. So filling the screen wash at the back of the engine bay is just a case of reaching to here. And if the bonnet was opening this way, that really would be in your way. So just a little mention of that to dispel all the criticism that was coming for having the bonnet opening that way. Last but not least, the Mustang, which really is looking like it's getting there now. Now this week we've been through a process which is tedious, but and to be honest, a bit stressful, but definitely much less stress than if we were doing it for the first time when it was painted. And that is trial fitting all of the things that attach to the outside of the body. So we've had the front and rear screens in, all of the stainless mouldings that go around them, the rear lights have been in, the mirrors, the mouldings that sit into here, the door handles, basically anything that attaches to the outside of the body. And it's just to be sure that those items fit without having to, file out holes or whatever, which in most cases they did, and which highlights why we bother doing that, because it's much better to do it now than when it's painted, because obviously if we file a hole out now and then paint it, there's paint on that bare metal, and we're going to go touching up holes and things. And also things like these stainless mouldings on here, they actually sit inside this aperture. So being sure that they are a really nice even fit to the shape of the aperture now is really important, because if we leave it till later on, then it's basically too late. You're just putting up with the fact that there might be an uneven gap. Doing it now, there's still time to tweak that aperture and get it to be a good fit, or even tweak the trim, but it's much nicer offering up a trim, tweaking it, offering up, tweaking it on a car where you're not worried about scratching the paint. So all that's been done now and then removed again, so that when it's a painted shell, fingers crossed, it's just a case of fitting everything, and hopefully it should fit. Although there seems to be a weird oddity in this car world where you do things like that, and yet still when you get to a painted shell, still something doesn't fit, and it's totally inexplicable sometimes. But hopefully we've covered everything we need to cover. So when this is painted and through in the assembly shop, a lot of the exterior stuff will just be a dead easy bolt-on fit. So I think Gaz is just in the process now of removing all the panels that were built up, so the wings, bonnet, boot lid, all that sort of stuff. So we can now start prepping the underside of those panels with a view to getting this in epoxy, which is the next step. He's got a little bit of sanding work to do on a couple of bits on you can see the underside of the dash. You give that another little skim there because he wasn't happy with that. But we're very close now to getting this in the booth, giving it a coat of epoxy to seal all this porous material in. It'll then be a case of doing the urethane coating on the underside and inside, and at that point it's totally waterproof. We'll wet sand the epoxy, but then it'll be final paint time. So finally, after all of that sanding, there's light at the end of the tunnel. So we'll see how he gets on next week with that, and we'll leave it at that for this week. See you next time.